Well, hello there, sugar. Pull up a chair and let me tell you a story that'll make your heart ache before it makes it sore. It all started on a Christmas evening that was supposed to be about peace on earth and goodwill to men, but in that big, old house on the hill, goodwill was in short supply. Now, you have to understand, it had been 18 months since Andrea lost her husband, David. 18 months of trying to keep her head above water while raising little Lily all on her own. Lily was only 8, a sweet thing with her daddy's eyes and a habit of holding onto her mama's hand just a little too tight whenever they visited the big house. The invitation, if you could even call it that, had come through a cold, clipped phone call from Andrea's sister, Meredith. It wasn't a "we miss you," it was a "be there at 6, and don't be late." As they pulled into the driveway, the house was glowing with those expensive white lights, looking like a postcard. But inside, the air was thin enough to snap. Andrea took a deep breath, adjusted Lily's velvet bow, and whispered, "We're just here for dinner, baby. Then we go home to our own cocoa." The moment they stepped through that heavy oak door, the chatter in the foyer didn't just stop, it died. There stood Andrea's father, Gerald, looking at his daughter not with love, but like she was a bill he didn't want to pay. Her mother, Patricia, didn't even look up from her glass of sherry, just offered a cheek that felt as cold as a window pane in December. "You're late," Gerald said, his voice like gravel. "No, Merry Christmas." "No, how are you, Lily?" "Just a judgment." Meredith floated over then, wearing a silk dress that probably cost more than Andrea's rent, offering a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Oh, Andrea, you look tired. But I suppose that's to be expected, isn't it? Come, the rest of the family is waiting. We've been talking about so many things." The way she said, talking, made the hair on the back of Andrea's neck stand up. As they walked toward the dining room, the floorboards creaked under their feet, and every aunt and cousin they passed offered those pitying, tight-lipped smiles, the kind people give you when they've been told a secret about you that you don't even know yourself. The table was set with the fine china and the heavy silver, but the warmth was missing. Andrea sat down, feeling 15 pairs of eyes boring into her, and she realized then that she wasn't a guest at this dinner. She was the main course. And as the wind howled against the glass outside, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Something was coming, and by the time the grace was said, the trap was already closing. To understand why that Christmas dinner felt more like a courtroom than a celebration, we have to look back at the shadow that had been hanging over Andrea for 18 months. It was a Tuesday, just a plain, ordinary Tuesday, when the world stopped turning. David was coming home from work, probably thinking about what to pick up for dinner, when a truck that didn't see a red light changed everything in the blink of an eye. Andrea went from being a happy wife to a hollow-eyed widow in the time it takes to answer a phone call. And while she was drowning in grief, trying to explain to Lily why Daddy wasn't coming through the door, the rest of the family was already doing math. You see, David was a careful man. He loved his girls fiercely, and he'd taken out a life insurance policy years ago that everyone had forgotten about, everyone except the lawyers. When that check for $2.3 million cleared, the silence from Andrea's family didn't just break, it turned into a chorus of "honey" and "sweetie." Suddenly, Meredith was calling every other day, dropping by with expensive lattes and helpful advice. But sugar, that kindness had thorns. Meredith started whispering. She'd tell Aunt Betty that Andrea was struggling with her grip on reality. She'd tell the cousins that the money was poisoning Andrea's mind, making her reckless. It was a slow, poison drip of gaslighting. Meredith would look Andrea right in the eye and say, "Oh, sister, you're so lucky you have me. You've never been good with numbers, and we both know how David used to handle everything because you couldn't." Every time Andrea tried to stand on her own 2 feet, Meredith was there to trip her up, acting like she was just reaching out to steady her. She started telling the family that Andrea was throwing money away on gambling and secret trips, painting a picture of a woman spiraling out of control. It was a master class in isolation. By the time that Christmas invitation rolled around, the family didn't see a grieving widow doing her best. They saw a problem that needed to be managed. Andrea would sit in her quiet apartment, looking at that bank balance, and she didn't feel rich. She felt like a target. She didn't know yet that her own sister had already started the paperwork to take control of it all. She just knew that every time her family smiled at her lately, she felt like she needed to check if she still had all her fingers after the handshake. The money was supposed to be Lily's future, but to the people sitting across from her at that dinner table, it was just a prize they hadn't won yet. Now, while the rest of the family was busy sharpening their knives and counting chickens that didn't belong to them, there was one person in that house who saw everything. Grandma Margaret. She was 85 years old, with a mind as sharp as a brand new sewing needle and a heart that didn't have a lick of patience for greed. A few days before that fateful dinner, Margaret had called Andrea and told her to come over early, just the 2 of them. When Andrea arrived, she found her grandmother sitting in her old velvet armchair, the one that smelled like lavender and peppermint. She didn't offer a polite smile, she offered a look of fierce protection. "Sit down, Andrea," she'd said, her voice steady as a rock. "And listen close, because the wolves are at the gate, and they've already started howling." Andrea tried to play it off, saying the family was just being a bit overbearing, but Margaret wasn't having it. She leaned in, her eyes boring into Andrea's. "I've sat in this house for 60 years, honey. I've watched my own daughter, Patricia, and that granddaughter of mine, Meredith, whisper in the corners since you buried David. They think I'm just an old woman who can't hear past the TV, but I've heard them planning how I managed you. They don't want to help you through your grief, they want to harvest it." Andrea felt the blood drain from her face as Grandma Margaret described the secret meetings and the phone calls she'd intercepted. It was like hearing a horror story where the monsters were the people who shared your DNA. Then, Margaret reached into the pocket of her heavy cardigan and pulled out an envelope. It was thick, cream-colored, and sealed with a dollop of deep red wax. It looked like something from another century. "Take this," Margaret whispered, pressing it into Andrea's palm. "Do not open it now. Do not tell a soul you have it. You take this to that dinner table, and you keep it hidden. You're going to feel like the world is closing in on you, Andrea." They're going to try to make you feel small, and they're going to try to make you feel crazy. She squeezed Andrea's hand with a strength that was surprising for a woman her age. When the moment comes, and you'll know it when the air goes still, you open this. It's the truth, and it's a shield. I've lived long enough to know that greed rots a person from the inside out, but I won't let them rot your life or that sweet baby Lily's future. You hold your head high, you hear me? You're a Whitmore woman, and we don't break for wolves. Andrea left that day with the envelope tucked deep in her purse, feeling its weight like a loaded gun. She didn't know what was inside, but for the first time in 18 months, she didn't feel like she was walking into the woods alone. She had the old matriarch in her corner, and Grandma Margaret never started a fight she didn't intend to finish. By the time the sun began to set on Christmas Eve, the air in that big house had turned thick enough to choke on. The pleasantries were over, and the wolves Grandma Margaret warned about finally stepped out from the shadows. It started in the study, just before the main course was served. Gerald called Andrea in, his face set like flint, while Meredith stood by the window, playing with her diamond bracelet like she was bored, though her eyes were sharp as tacks. Andrea, her father started, his voice heavy with a guilt he wanted her to carry. I didn't want to bring this up during the holidays, but the business is on the brink. 30 years of my life, gone. And here you are, sitting on a mountain of money that David left behind. It's not right, a daughter watching her father drown while she's swimming in gold. It was a low blow, sugar, reaching right for Andrea's heartstrings. He talked about the debts, the suppliers calling at all hours, and the shame of losing the family name. Then Patricia chimed in from the doorway, her voice trembling just enough to sound fragile. We're just worried, honey. If the store goes, we lose the house. We lose everything. And we know you want to help, but you've always been so flighty with responsibilities. That was the gaslighting, plain and simple, making her feel like she was the one failing them. That's when Meredith moved in for the kill. She pulled a thick manila folder from the desk, her movements smooth and rehearsed. We've thought of a solution that protects everyone, Andrea. Especially you. I've had the lawyers draw up some power of attorney papers. If you sign these, I can move the funds around to save Dad's business and set up a managed trust for Lily. You won't have to worry about a thing. No more bills, no more difficult decisions. I'll handle the dirty work so you can just focus on being a mother. She laid the papers out on the desk and held out a gold pen, her smile as thin as a razor blade. It's the only way to keep the family together. If you don't do this, and the store goes under, well, everyone will know it was because you chose your bank account over your own flesh and blood. The room felt like it was shrinking. They weren't asking, they were demanding. They were using her grief and her love for her father as a cage. Andrea looked at that pen, then at the hard, expectant faces of the people who were supposed to protect her. She could feel the cream-colored envelope Grandma Margaret had given her pressing against her side from inside her purse. I need to read them first, Andrea whispered, her voice trembling. Meredith's smile vanished in a heartbeat. Read them? Don't you trust us? We're your family, Andrea. not some strangers on the street. Signing these is how you prove you're still one of us. The trap was wide open, baited with shame and polished with lies. And as the clock in the hallway chimed the hour, Andrea realized the peaceful dinner waiting for them in the next room was nothing more than a stage for the final act of her betrayal. When they walked back into that dining room, the atmosphere had shifted from cold to downright lethal. Andrea took her seat, her knuckles white as she gripped her napkin, while the rest of the relatives, aunts, uncles, and cousins, sat there like a jury waiting for the foreman to speak. The clinking of silverware was the only sound until Gerald cleared his throat, a sound that cut through the room like a gunshot. "Family," he began, standing at the head of the table like a judge on the bench. "We have a tragedy in our midst, and I don't just mean the loss of David. We have a member of this family who has lost her way. Andrea has been blessed with a fortune, yet she sits on it while her own father's legacy crumbles. But it's worse than that." He looked at Meredith, who took that as her cue to stand. She didn't look like a sister, she looked like an executioner. "It's hard to say this," Meredith whispered, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "but we've seen the records. Andrea has been throwing David's legacy away. The gambling, the secret spending, she's unstable. We offered to help her quietly, to manage the money so Lily would have a future, but she refused. She'd rather watch us all fail than give up her vices." The gasps around the table were like a physical blow. Aunt Betty shook her head in shame, and Uncle Tom looked away in disgust. Andrea tried to speak, her voice coming out in a strangled plea. "That's not true. I've never gambled a day in my life." "Don't lie, Andrea," her mother snapped, finally finding her voice. "It's pathetic. You're unfit. Unfit to handle that money, and frankly, I worry if you're fit to raise that sweet little girl sitting right there." Poor Lily started to cry, the silent, heaving kind of sobs that break your heart. She reached for her mother's hand, but Patricia just looked at them both with a sneer. "You've chosen your path, Andrea. You've chosen greed over your own blood." Gerald slammed his hand on the mahogany table, making the crystal glasses scream. "Enough. I won't have a liar and a thief at my Christmas table. You had a chance to do the right thing, to sign those papers and let your sister save this family. Since you won't, you are no longer a Whitmore. You take your things, you take your child, and you leave this house. Leave and never return. Christmas is so much better without you." The room went deathly still. 15 relatives, people Andrea had known her whole life, just stared. Not one person stood up. Not one person said, "Wait." The silence was a verdict. Andrea felt the world tilting, the walls of the house she grew up in suddenly feeling like a prison. She looked at her father's red face, her sister's triumphant smirk, and her mother's cold eyes. She reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against the heavy, wax-sealed envelope Grandma Margaret had given her. The air in the room went perfectly still, just like the old woman said it would. The execution was over, or so they thought. But they didn't realize that when you push a woman with nothing left to lose, she finally finds the strength to stand her ground. Andrea stood up slowly, clutching Lily to her side, and looked at the monsters she used to call family. "Then you won't mind me doing this," she whispered. And the 5-minute countdown to their downfall began right then and there. The silence that followed my father's ultimatum was heavy, like the air right before a cyclone touches down. Meredith was wearing a look of pure triumph, and my mother was already turning back to her turkey as if Lily and I had already evaporated into thin air. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd broken me so thoroughly that I'd just tuck my tail and run into the night. But I didn't run. I reached into my purse, but it wasn't for my car keys. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized 3 days ago. I put it on speaker and set it right there on the white lace tablecloth for everyone to hear. "Marcus," I said, my voice finally finding its iron. "It's time. Bring everything." "I'm already at the front gate, Andrea," a deep, professional voice responded. "I'll be there in 30 seconds. The look on Meredith's face shifted from a smirk to a twitch. "Who is that? Who are you calling at my dinner table?" my father roared, but before he could even stand up, the heavy front door opened. In walked Marcus Webb. Now, Marcus wasn't just any lawyer, he was David's best friend from college, a man who loved my husband like a brother and had been quietly watching over me from the shadows. He walked into that dining room carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it held the weight of the world. He didn't say a Merry Christmas. He just started laying out folders in front of my relatives. "My name is Marcus Webb," he said, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "And I'm here to discuss a little project called Operation Andrea." You could have heard a pin drop on a feather pillow. Meredith's face went the color of curdled milk. "I have here," Marcus continued, opening the first folder, "a verified chain of emails and text messages between Meredith Harrison and Patricia Outton, dating back to exactly 2 weeks after David's funeral. It seems they weren't mourning. They were plotting." He started reading, and the words were like ice water being thrown on the room. "Andrea is weak," he read from an email Meredith sent to my mother. "She's easy pickings. If we frame it as saving Dad's store, she'll hand over the insurance money without even reading the fine print. We just need to isolate her from the rest of the family first. Tell the cousins she's gambling. Tell the aunts she's unstable. By Christmas, she'll be begging us to take the burden off her hands." The aunts and uncles started murmuring, their eyes darting between the papers and the pale, shaking woman at the head of the table. Uncle Tom picked up a copy, his face turning a dark, angry red as he read his own name in their schemes. "It was a coordinated character assassination," Marcus said, looking my father dead in the eye. "And every word of it, the gambling, the instability, was a lie manufactured to steal a widow's inheritance." Meredith tried to scream that it was fake, that it was a violation of her privacy, but the truth was already out of the bag and running wild. The public trial they'd staged for me had just turned into their own sentencing. And I just sat there, holding Lily close, watching the mask of my perfect family slip away to reveal the rot underneath. 5 minutes. That's all it took for the truth to burn their house of cards to the ground. While the room was spinning from the truth Marcus had just laid bare, the real earthquake was still to come. You see, Meredith and my parents were so focused on my insurance money that they forgot who really held the deed to their dignity. My father was sputtering about private family matters, but then, a sound cut through the chaos, the sharp, rhythmic tap of a cane against the hardwood floor. Grandma Margaret stood up. Now, she hadn't said much during dinner, but when she rose, even the air seemed to bow down. She didn't look at the lawyers or the cousins, she looked straight at her own daughter, Patricia. "Sit down, Gerald," Margaret said, her voice like a velvet hammer. "And Patricia, stop that crying. It doesn't move me anymore." She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, silver letter opener. She looked at me and nodded, and that's when I finally broke the red wax on the cream-colored envelope she'd given me. My hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled, but as I pulled out the document, I saw the blue legal seal at the top. "Go on, Marcus," Grandma Margaret commanded. "Read the part they haven't guessed yet." Marcus cleared his throat, his eyes flashing with a bit of grim satisfaction. "As of 3 o'clock this afternoon, Margaret Ellen Whitmore has executed a final codicil to her last will and testament. It supersedes all previous versions. It bequeaths this primary residence, the surrounding 3 acres, and the entirety of the Whitmore estate, valued at $1.8 million, not to her daughter Patricia, and not to her granddaughter Meredith." The silence in that room was so thick you could have carved it. Meredith was leaning forward, her mouth hanging open like a landed fish. "The entire estate," Marcus continued, "is left to her granddaughter, Andrea Louise Outton, to be held in an unbreakable trust for her and her daughter, Lily. Furthermore, Mrs. Whitmore has granted Andrea immediate power of attorney over all property matters, effective today." If the first reveal was a spark, this was a wildfire. This house, this big, beautiful colonial that Meredith had already planned to renovate and sell, didn't belong to the favored ones anymore. It was mine. The very roof over their heads was now sitting in my hands. "You said Christmas would be better without Andrea," Grandma Margaret said, her eyes boring into my mother. "Well, Patricia, you might just get your wish. Because this is Andrea's house now. She decides who sits at this table. She decides who stays and who goes. I've watched you all treat this family like a business transaction for 18 months. You wanted to talk about managing assets? Well, now you're being managed." Meredith let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated greed being crushed. My father slumped into his chair, looking at the walls as if they were closing in on him. They had tried to trap me in a corner of shame, but Grandma Margaret had built me a fortress instead. The ultimate prize they'd been eyeing for years was gone, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one looking for a place to belong. I was the one holding the keys. It's a funny thing about pride, sugar. It stands tall and puffed up like a peacock until the ground falls out from under it, and then it crumples faster than a house of cards in a breeze. The moment Marcus finished reading that will, the air went right out of Meredith and my parents. The woman who had just called me unfit, and, pathetic, suddenly found her legs wouldn't hold her. My mother, Patricia, actually dropped to her knees right there on that expensive Persian rug, her hands reaching out toward me like she was trying to catch a ghost. "Andrea, baby," she sobbed, and the sound made my skin crawl. "We didn't mean those things. We were so stressed about the business. You know how your father gets. We love you. We've always loved you." Then there was Meredith. The silk-clad executioner was suddenly a beggar. She grabbed my arm, her perfect manicure digging into my skin. "Andrea, please. You can't do this. I have debts. I have investors. If Derek finds out I've been hiding the business losses, he'll leave me. We're sisters. You can't let your own sister lose everything over a little misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. That's what she called 18 months of character assassination and a plot to steal my child's future. I looked down at them, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel that desperate, aching need to make them happy. I didn't feel the urge to apologize for existing. I felt clean. I gently unhooked Meredith's fingers from my sleeve and stepped back, pulling Lily close to my side. "I want you all to listen to me very carefully," I said, and my voice was so calm it surprised even me. "For years, I let you define who I was. I let you tell me I was the weak one, the creative one who couldn't handle the real world. I stayed quiet while you whispered, and I smiled while you insulted my husband's memory. But that ends tonight." The relatives were all standing now, some looking ashamed, some just watching the wreckage. I looked my father in the eye, the man who had just told me to leave and never return. "You told me Christmas would be better without me," I told him. "And you know what? You're right. Because a home isn't made of mahogany tables and fine china. It's made of trust. And there isn't a drop of it left in this room. You didn't want a daughter, you wanted a bank account. And Meredith, you didn't want a sister, you wanted a mark." I turned to Marcus and nodded. "Change the locks tomorrow morning. Nobody enters this house without my written permission." A fresh wail went up from my mother, but I wasn't looking at her anymore. I turned to Grandma Margaret, who was standing there with a look of pure, unadulterated pride. "Grandma," I said, "I think it's time we went home. Our home." Grandma Margaret smiled, tucked her arm into mine, and we walked out of that dining room. We left the turkey cooling on the plates and the wolves crying on the floor. As we stepped out into the crisp Christmas air, Lily looked up at me and whispered, "Are we going to be okay, Mommy?" I kissed the top of her head and looked at the stars. "Better than okay, baby. We're finally free." We didn't look back once. Not even when the front door of the big house clicked shut behind us for the very last time. Now, sugar, they say the wheels of justice grind slow, but in the weeks following that frosty Christmas night, they seemed to pick up a terrifying bit of speed. You see, the truth is like water. Once the dam breaks, there's no plugging the hole with lies anymore. The story of what happened at that dinner table didn't stay within those four walls. It traveled through the town like a summer storm, shaking every branch of the family tree. The first thing to fall was Gerald's pride and joy, that hardware store. It turns out, when you build a business on the idea of being a pillar of the community, people expect you to have some actual structural integrity in your heart. Once the word got out about how he'd tried to swindle his widowed daughter, the regular customers just stopped coming. The big contractors took their business down the road, and by the end of January, that life's work he'd been so worried about was nothing but a going out of business sign and a pile of empty shelves. He'd tried to steal my future to save his past, and in the end, he lost both. But the real reckoning happened in Meredith's house. Her husband, Derek, a quiet man, but a decent one, had no idea about the depths of her debts or the cruelty of her schemes. When Marcus sent over the authenticated documents as part of the legal fallout, Derek realized he'd been sleeping next to a stranger for years. He didn't scream, and he didn't make a scene. He just packed his bags while Meredith was out trying to charm a new client and moved into a small apartment across town. He sent a note saying he couldn't stay with a woman who would look at her own niece and see a financial obstacle. For Meredith, losing her status was a fate worse than death, and watching her perfect life crumble on social media was a bitter pill she had to swallow every single day. And the rest of the family? Well, honey, the same aunts and uncles who sat in silence during the dinner were suddenly very loud once they saw which way the wind was blowing. They stopped answering Patricia's calls. They forgot to invite Meredith to the New Year's brunch. The isolation they had planned for me became their own cage. I'd see them sometimes from a distance, my parents looking older, smaller, standing in the driveway of the house that now legally belonged to me. They were waiting for a phone call, a sign of forgiveness, a return to the way things were. But some things, once broken, can't be glued back together, no matter how much you wish they could. I wasn't being mean, sugar, I was just being finished. I was busy watching the rot clear away so that something healthy could finally start to grow in its place. The wolves had lost their teeth, and for the first time in 18 months, the only sound I heard when I woke up in the morning was the peaceful silence of a life that finally belonged to me. By the time the spring thaw started turning the garden soil soft and dark, the big house didn't feel like a museum of old grudges anymore. It felt like a home. Grandma Margaret moved into the sunny suite on the first floor, and Lily's laughter started echoing down those long hallways, chasing away the ghosts of every cold word ever spoken in those rooms. We traded the fine china for mismatched mugs, and the heavy silence of the past was replaced by the sound of the radio playing in the kitchen and the smell of fresh-baked bread. I spent those first few months stripping the wallpaper, peeling back the layers of a life I'd been told to live, and finding the solid wood underneath. Grandma Margaret would sit on the porch in her rocker, watching Lily hunt for fireflies, and she'd tell me that the house had never looked more beautiful. It wasn't because of the paint or the flowers, sugar, it was because the people inside actually wanted to be there. The insurance money stayed in a quiet account, growing for Lily's college and a life she gets to choose for herself. I kept my job, kept my head down, and kept my circle small. Every now and then, my phone would buzz with a message from my mother or a desperate email from Meredith, but I realized I didn't owe them my peace just because we shared a last name. I didn't hate them. Hatred is too heavy a burden to carry when you're trying to build a future, but I finally understood that family isn't a debt you pay in blood and suffering. You see, honey, there's the family you're born with, and then there's the family you find when the world goes dark. David was my family. Marcus, who stood by me when he didn't have to, is my family. And Grandma Margaret, who chose truth over tradition, is the very heart of it. So, if you're sitting there tonight feeling like you're trapped in a house that doesn't love you, or carrying a weight that isn't yours to bear, I want you to remember something. You don't need permission to be strong. You don't need an invitation to walk away from people who only see you as a means to an end. Blood might be thicker than water, but love is thicker than both. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can ever do is close a door so that you can finally open a window. We're doing just fine here in our big house on the hill, living a life built on honesty and a little bit of grit. My name is Andrea, and I'm a Whitmore woman, and thanks to a wise old lady and a little girl's smile, I finally know what that means. Thank you for sitting a spell with me and listening to my story. Until next time, you take care of your heart, you hear? Because you're the only one who truly knows what it's worth.